A millionaire gives $350 to a beggar, but when he sees her the next day, he discovers a secret that changes everything. The rain poured heavily that cold night, turning the city streets into rivers reflecting the yellowish glow of the streetlights. Inside his luxurious car, Richard drove slowly as the windshield wipers struggled to clear the relentless water. He wasn't in a hurry, he never was anymore, not since he lost Valerie, his beloved wife, nearly 10 years ago. For him, the nights were merely preludes to the emptiness he felt every morning. As he turned a corner, something caught his attention, a figure huddled under an improvised blanket, trying to shield a crying baby. The young woman looked desperate, soaked to the bone, and shivering from the cold. Richard hesitated for a moment, but the shadow of Valerie's memory and his own conscience pushed him to act. He pulled over near the sidewalk, rolled down his window, and called out. "Do you need help? Get in. You can't stay out in this rain." The woman looked at him warily, clutching the baby tightly to her chest, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion and fear. She took a tentative step toward the car. After a brief moment of hesitation, she accepted the offer. Richard opened the passenger door and watched as she carefully climbed in, shielding the baby as if it were her last source of strength. Sitting in the passenger seat, the woman gasped for air, trying to soothe the crying baby. Her voice was low, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. "Thank you. I didn't know what else to do. He's cold, but I have nowhere to go tonight." As Richard put the car in motion again, he reached for the jacket in the back seat and handed it to her. "Take this. It'll help keep you both warm." She gratefully accepted, wrapping the baby in the warm jacket. Gradually, the baby's cries subsided, and Richard could see a sense of relief wash over the child's face. As he drove, the woman began to share her story, hesitant at first but overcome by the need to unburden herself. "My name is Sophie. I lost my job a few weeks ago. I'm trying my best for him, but sometimes it feels like the whole world is against me." Richard listened silently, taking in every word. Something about her moved him deeply. It wasn't just her situation, there was a resemblance to Valerie, not only in her features but in the evident strength behind her fragility. When they reached a small diner that stayed open all night, Richard decided to stop. He took $350 from his wallet and placed it on the table between them. "Please, use this to find a place to stay and get something to eat. And buy something for the baby. He deserves to be safe." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't just the money, it was the kindness of a stranger on a night when everything seemed lost. "Why are you helping me like this?" she asked, her voice breaking. Richard took a moment to answer, gazing out the window at the endless rain. "Because someone I loved very much would have done the same. And maybe, in some way, this will make her smile, wherever she is." The goodbye was brief, but it left a weight on both their hearts. As Richard returned to his car, he felt an inexplicable sense of nostalgia for the woman he had just helped. That night, he dreamed of Valerie, but this time, there was another presence in the dream, the young mother and her baby, surrounded by a soft, glowing light. The next morning, Richard woke up early, still feeling the echoes of the strange dream that had accompanied him through the night. He decided that the best way to clear his mind was to stick to his usual routine, visiting the cemetery and bringing flowers to Valerie's grave. It was his way of staying connected to her, even if only through memory. With a bouquet of white lilies in hand, Richard arrived at the cemetery under a cloudy sky. He walked steadily toward the grave, the place he had visited without fail every week for nearly a decade. But something broke the usual calm of the place. In the distance, he saw a familiar figure kneeling in front of the polished marble of the tombstone. It was Sophie. Richard froze in his tracks, unable to understand why the young mother was there, at the most sacred place in his life. Sophie, unaware of his presence, was speaking softly, almost as if she were confessing her secrets to someone invisible. In her arms, she held the baby, still wrapped in the jacket Richard had given her the night before. "Mom, forgive me. I didn't know how to find you sooner, Sophie murmured as tears streamed down her cheeks. Richard felt the ground beneath his feet shift. Mom. The word echoed endlessly in his mind. It couldn't be a coincidence. With his heart pounding, he took a few steps forward, and his voice broke through the tense air. Sophie, what are you doing here? He asked carefully, trying to steady the tremor in his voice. Sophie startled, clutching the baby more tightly. When she recognized Richard, her expression shifted from surprise to a mixture of shame and pain. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Sophie swallowed hard before answering. I didn't know how to tell you last night. This is really hard to explain. She gestured hesitantly toward the grave. This is my mother's grave. The woman who gave me up for adoption more than 20 years ago. Richard felt as though a bolt of lightning had struck him. Disbelief washed over him as his thoughts scrambled to piece everything together. His gaze shifted between Sophie, the baby, and Valerie's name engraved on the headstone. Your mother. Valerie never told me, his voice faltered as he struggled to form the words. How is this possible? Valerie and I were married for 20 years. I didn't know she had a daughter. Sophie nodded, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her sweater. I only found out recently. I always knew I was adopted, but my adoptive mother left me some letters before she passed. One of them had Valerie's name and this location. That's all I know. Richard felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. If Valerie had kept something this important a secret, what other truths were buried with her? Without realizing it, his legs trembled, and he had to steady himself against a nearby tree. Do you understand what you're saying, Sophie? He finally asked, his tone a mixture of desperation and hope. If what you're saying is true, then you're my daughter. Sophie looked at him cautiously, as if afraid of what the answer might be. The baby, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the moment, babbled softly, drawing their attention momentarily. Richard felt something stir within him that he hadn't felt in years, a spark of connection. A possibility. I don't know, Sophie replied honestly. I just know I have more questions than answers. And I think you do too. The silence between Richard and Sophie felt eternal, heavy with unspoken questions both were too afraid to ask. Richard, unable to hold back, stepped a little closer, searching Sophie's eyes for some confirmation of what his heart already suspected. He couldn't ignore the resemblance, the contour of her face, the slight movements of her hands as she spoke, everything reminded him of Valerie. Sophie, Richard began, his voice trembling, if all of this is true. I need to know. I need to understand why Valerie never told me. Sophie nodded slowly, her fingers trembling as she tried to calm the baby, who was starting to fuss. I need answers too. But I don't even know where to start. My adoptive mother never gave me more information than those letters. I found them hidden among her things after she passed away. The weight of her words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. If Valerie had made such a monumental decision in the past, it must have been for reasons that ran painfully deep. But what reasons could have been so powerful as to keep something like this hidden from the man who, until his last breath, believed he knew all her secrets? Can we sit? Sophie finally asked, pointing to a nearby bench. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed a mix of anguish and vulnerability. Of course, Richard replied, following her to the bench as the first drops of a new rain began to fall. They sat down, and Sophie began to unfold a paper she had tucked in her bag. It was a letter, the ink faded with time. She handed it to Richard, who took it with trembling hands. He recognized Valerie's handwriting immediately. Dear Sophie, he began to read softly. If you're reading this, it means you found your way to learn about your origins. I am deeply sorry for not having the strength to keep you by my side. I loved you from the very beginning, but circumstances forced me to make a decision that broke me. I hope you can forgive me someday. Richard stopped reading, feeling the air leave his lungs. His eyes returned to Sophie, who was watching him with tears streaming down her face. Is this all you have from her?" he asked, handing the letter back. Sophie nodded. "It's the only letter she left me directly. There's another one, but it's addressed to someone else. I don't know who." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process it all. It was impossible to ignore the fact that Valerie had been forced to make such a heartbreaking decision. But why hadn't she trusted him with the truth? What could have been so grave that she kept him in the dark? "We'll find the truth," Richard finally said, with a determination he hadn't felt in years. "If Valerie left you these letters, it means she wanted you to know the truth, even if she couldn't tell me." Sophie looked at him with a mix of gratitude and skepticism. "Do you really want to help me? This won't be easy." Richard looked her straight in the eyes. "If you're my daughter, Sophie, if you're the last connection I have to Valerie, then there's nothing I won't do to make up for the time we've lost." At that moment, the baby babbled something, drawing both of their attention. Richard smiled faintly, letting a small spark of hope cross his heart. This was only the beginning of a journey that promised to be as painful as it was revealing. Richard decided that the first step in uncovering the truth was to delve into Valerie's past, piecing together the missing fragments of this painful puzzle. He agreed to meet Sophie the following day to organize their thoughts and decide what to do with the second letter. Before parting ways, Richard insisted she accept some money to cover the baby's immediate needs. Though Sophie hesitated at first, she eventually agreed, feeling she had no other choice. That night, alone in his mansion, Richard wandered through the halls with a strange mix of nostalgia and determination. He stopped in front of an old glass cabinet where he kept Valerie's most cherished belongings, photographs, jewelry, and a small notebook she always carried. He picked it up, hoping to find something that might shed light on this well-kept secret. Opening the notebook, his eyes stopped on a page where Valerie had written a poem. "Among the shadows of hidden love. A choice was born, tinged with pain. Forgive me for what you cannot know. But my heart will always search for you." The words hit him like a gust of wind. Could it be that Valerie had left clues about Sophie without him realizing it? His wife's careful handwriting now seemed to whisper secrets from the past. The next day, Richard arrived early at the spot where he'd agreed to meet Sophie. The young woman was waiting, the baby asleep in her arms, her expression filled with uncertainty. They decided the next step was to read the second letter. Sophie carefully pulled it from her bag and handed it to Richard. "This letter is addressed to someone named Lucia," Sophie said, showing it to him. "I have no idea who that is." Richard took the letter and began to read aloud. "Dear Lucia, I entrust to you the most precious thing I have because I know you will understand my pain. Sophie deserves a life I cannot give her now, and I know you will be the mother who can love her in my place. Please care for her and protect her. One day, I hope she will find her way back to me." Richard looked up, the name Lucia ringing in his mind. Suddenly, he remembered a woman who had worked for years as a housekeeper at Valerie's family estate. Lucia had been more than an employee, she had been almost a second mother to Valerie, someone she trusted implicitly. If Valerie had entrusted Sophie to Lucia, then she must have known more than she ever revealed. "Lucia," Richard said quietly, as if speaking her name brought long-buried memories to the surface. "I know who she is. She was very close to Valerie. If anyone has answers, it's her." Sophie stared at him in disbelief. "Do you think she's still alive? That we can find her?" Richard nodded, clutching the letter tightly. "We'll have to look for her. If Valerie trusted her, then Lucia holds the answers we need." Sophie, though apprehensive, felt a small spark of hope. For the first time in years, it seemed the pieces of her story were beginning to fit together. They agreed to start searching for Lucia, knowing that finding her could change everything, for better or worse. Yet deep in his heart, Richard couldn't help but wonder, what else had Valerie kept hidden, and why? Richard and Sophie wasted no time. The next day, with Valerie's letter in hand, they began their search for Lucia. Richard recalled that, after Valerie's passing, he had lost touch with many of the people close to her, including Lucia. They decided to start at the place where Richard believed Lucia had lived for years, a small house in a modest neighborhood, not far from the mansion where Valerie had grown up. The drive to the neighborhood was quiet but charged with anticipation. Sophie, though grateful for Richard's determination, still maintained an emotional barrier. Trust didn't come easily after years of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Richard couldn't stop glancing at Sophie, wondering how it was possible that his daughter had lived all this time without him knowing she existed. When they arrived, the neighborhood was peaceful, with children playing in the streets and the smell of home-cooked meals wafting through the air. Richard parked the car in front of a modest house with a weathered facade, its flower pots by the door holding wilted plants. He rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. Determined not to give up, he rang again, this time louder. Finally, an older woman appeared at the window, squinting as if trying to recognize them. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Lucia, it's me, Richard," he said. "I don't know if you remember, you were with Valerie for many years." The woman's eyes widened with surprise, and her expression shifted from caution to a mix of nostalgia and pain. She slowly opened the door, but when she saw Sophie standing behind Richard, she froze, as if seeing a ghost. "My God," Lucia murmured, placing a hand on her chest. "It's her, isn't it? It's Sophie." Sophie stepped forward, confused. You know who I am?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I could never forget your face, child. I saw you when you were just a baby. Valerie. Valerie asked me to care for you. It was the hardest decision of her life." Richard, feeling a storm of emotions, stepped forward as well. "Lucia, we need to know the truth. Valerie never told me we had a daughter. Why? What really happened?" Lucia sighed, gesturing for them to come inside her modest living room. They sat around a small table, and Lucia, her voice trembling, began to speak. "Valerie was terrified, Richard. Her family forced her to hide her pregnancy. Your marriage was going through a difficult time, and her parents feared the news would destroy it. She begged me to take Sophie and raise her far away from the chaos. But I couldn't keep her. My situation was complicated, so I found a family who promised to give her a home filled with love. It was the most painful decision of my life." Sophie clenched her hands in her lap, struggling to hold back tears. "Why didn't anyone try to find me? Why didn't she look for me?" Lucia looked at her with deep sorrow. "Valerie wanted to, I know she did. But fear and guilt held her back. She thought that, in the end, the best thing for you was to stay far away from the pain we carried." Richard felt a wave of guilt and anger. If only he had known, if only Valerie had trusted him, perhaps things could have been different. He reached out and took Sophie's trembling hand, speaking to her gently. "Sophie, this doesn't change what I want for us. I want us to build something together, to not let the past define what we can have now." Lucia watched them both, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "I hope you find the peace that Valerie never could." Although they had uncovered part of the truth, Lucia's words left Richard and Sophie with more questions than answers. What other secrets had Valerie kept, and how would they face them together? The conversation with Lucia left Richard and Sophie with heavy hearts and minds full of questions. As they left the modest house, Sophie couldn't help but cast one last glance at Lucia, trying to decipher if there was more the woman hadn't said. Richard, on the other hand, was lost in his thoughts, replaying every word, every gesture, attempting to understand Valerie's decisions and the weight she had carried alone. During the drive back, Sophie broke the silence. "Do you think Valerie was really as alone as Lucia said?" she asked softly, adjusting the blanket over her sleeping baby. Richard gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. I want to believe she wasn't, he finally replied. But if she kept something this important from me, maybe she was more alone than I ever realized. Sophie nodded silently, understanding that Richard's own wounds were surfacing. Yet, an idea began forming in her mind. There was still something that could offer them answers: Valerie's journal. When they arrived at Richard's mansion, Sophie, for the first time, accepted his invitation to come inside. Though she had initially resisted depending on him, something in Lucia's words had deeply moved her. She wanted to learn more about Valerie, not just as the distant figure who had written those letters, but as the woman she had been. Richard guided her through the halls, where portraits of Valerie adorned the walls, each capturing different moments of her life. She was beautiful, Sophie murmured, stopping in front of a portrait of Valerie smiling in a light blue dress. She had a light in her eyes. Richard paused beside her, gazing at the portrait with a melancholic expression. Yes, she did. But there was also a sadness in her that I never knew how to ease. Maybe now I understand why. After a moment, Richard led Sophie to his study, where he retrieved Valerie's journal from a shelf. It was a worn leather-bound book with faded gold edges. He handed it to Sophie with care, as though it were a sacred object. "This is it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never read it completely. I didn't want to invade her privacy, even after her death. But I think you should be the first to read it." Sophie took the journal with trembling hands and opened it to a random page. Valerie's words were filled with passion, pain, and love. "Today, more than ever, I miss Sophie. Every time I hear a child's laughter, my heart breaks a little more. Richard doesn't know, I can't tell him, but I dream of the day she returns to my life, even if only to tell me she's okay." A choked sob escaped Sophie as her eyes scanned the words. Richard, moved, stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. "She thought about you every day," he said softly. "She never forgot you, Sophie." Sophie closed the journal, clutching it to her chest. For the first time, she felt she could forgive Valerie, even though the pain of her absence was still profound. She looked at Richard, her voice steady with determination. "I want to read more. I want to understand her, to know who she really was. Maybe that will help us heal." Richard nodded, knowing this was an important step for both of them. Though the path to the truth still seemed long, Valerie's journal promised to be a guide through the secrets and emotions that had remained buried for years. Sophie spent the night immersed in Valerie's journal. Sitting in one of the spacious rooms of Richard's mansion, with little Gabriel sleeping in an improvised crib, she delved into the pages that seemed to whisper secrets from the past. Every word Valerie had written felt like a window into her soul, a mix of love, regret, and a profound longing that Sophie now understood more clearly. In one of the entries, Valerie wrote about the day she made the decision to give Sophie up for adoption. Sophie read, tears streaming down her face. "Lucia tried to stop me. She said I would regret it someday. But the fear of destroying what little was left of my marriage with Richard was stronger. My parents insisted it was the best thing for her, that I couldn't give her what she needed. But how does a mother part with her child without feeling like her soul is being torn apart? Sophie, if you ever read this, I want you to know that you were always the best part of me." Sophie closed the journal, her hands trembling. She now understood that Valerie hadn't acted out of a lack of love but out of fear and pressure. Though the pain was still present, a spark of understanding began to grow inside her. She decided she needed to share this with Richard. The next morning, she found him in the main sitting room, sipping his coffee while gazing at the photographs of Valerie on the mantel. Sophie sat across from him, placing the journal on the table between them. "She loved you," Sophie began, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "She loved you so much that she thought keeping this secret was the only way to protect what you had." Richard looked up, surprised by Sophie's words. He reached out for the journal, but Sophie gently stopped him. "There's more," she said. "Valerie mentioned that her parents played a big role in all of this. She implies they pressured her to give me up for adoption, but she doesn't explain why. Richard frowned, his thoughts drifting back to the years when he first met Valerie's parents. They had always been cold and controlling, obsessed with appearances and the family's reputation. He remembered heated arguments with them, especially when he and Valerie married, a union they had considered a reckless mistake. They always tried to control everything in her life, Richard murmured, lost in his memories. Valerie used to say she was afraid of disappointing them. But I never imagined they could have pushed her into something so cruel. Sophie watched him, waiting for more, but Richard seemed caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Finally, he looked up, his expression resolute. We need answers. If her parents were involved in this, I want to confront the truth. Maybe there's still someone who knows more than we do. Sophie nodded, sharing his determination. She didn't know if anyone from that side of the family was still around to help, but she was ready to search. For the first time in years, she felt she wasn't alone in her fight to understand her past. At that moment, Gabriel, playing on the floor with a small stuffed toy, let out a cheerful babble that drew their attention. Richard smiled faintly, and Sophie couldn't help but notice how, little by little, the man who had been a stranger to her was starting to feel like family. As they prepared to dig deeper into Valerie's past, they both understood that the revelations ahead could be both healing and burdensome. But they were ready to face the truths of the past together. Richard and Sophie decided the next step was to investigate Valerie's family. Although her parents had passed away years ago, they knew there were still relatives who might shed light on what had happened. Richard remembered Dolores, a close cousin of Valerie who had been a constant figure in her life, albeit always under the shadow of Valerie's strict parents. Dolores lived in a stately home on the outskirts of the city. Her reserved nature had always been warmer than the other members of the family, and Richard hoped that after so many years, she might finally be willing to speak openly. When they arrived, a housekeeper greeted them and led them to an elegant parlor adorned with antiques. Dolores appeared shortly after, an elderly woman with a posture that radiated pride and grace. Her eyes narrowed as she recognized Richard, but softened when her gaze shifted to Sophie. She looks just like her, Dolores murmured, approaching slowly. Richard, who is this young woman? Why does she have that face? Feeling a bit intimidated, Sophie introduced herself with a steady voice. I'm Sophie, Valerie's daughter. I know this must come as a surprise, but I'm searching for answers about my past and what really happened. Dolores seemed to waver for a moment, clutching the back of a chair for support. She looked to Richard for confirmation. It's true, Dolores, Richard said gravely. Sophie is our daughter. Valerie never told me, but we're piecing together the truth. We need to know what really happened and why Valerie made that decision. Dolores exhaled deeply, her eyes filling with a mix of sadness and guilt. Sitting carefully in a nearby chair, she gestured for them to do the same. Valerie's parents, they started it all, Dolores said finally. She was terrified of disappointing them. When they discovered she was pregnant, they insisted she hide the truth. They claimed a child at that time would ruin her life, that society would judge her. Richard clenched his fists, struggling to contain his anger. And you, Dolores? You knew all of this? Did you try to help her? Dolores lowered her gaze, ashamed. I tried, Richard. But her parents were relentless. They warned me that if I intervened, they would cast me out of the family. Valerie confided in me that she wanted to keep Sophie, but her parents forced her to find a solution that didn't involve her directly. Sophie leaned forward, her voice trembling. Why didn't anyone care about what I needed? Why didn't anyone think about what it would mean for me to grow up not knowing my real family? Dolores looked up, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, Sophie. We all failed. But Valerie never stopped loving you. Not a day went by when she didn't speak of you, even in her final years. Richard, though furious at the manipulation Valerie had endured, knew that blaming Dolores wouldn't change the past. He stood up and looked at Sophie with determination. "Sophie, we've learned what we came for. Now we know that Valerie fought as much as she could. But we can't stop here. There's still more to uncover." Dolores watched them, her voice breaking as she spoke. "If there's anything more you need, I'll do whatever I can to help. Valerie was like a sister to me, and I failed her. I don't want to fail you, too." Richard nodded and took Dolores's hand in gratitude. Sophie, though still hurt, began to feel that the weight of the past, while overwhelming, was becoming more bearable with each truth revealed. As they left the house, Richard turned to Sophie and spoke gently. "Every step brings us closer to understanding who Valerie really was. We're not alone in this." Holding Gabriel in her arms, Sophie nodded, feeling for the first time that the emptiness in her life was beginning to be filled. Richard and Sophie didn't waste time. The next day, armed with Valerie's letter, they began their search for Lucia. Although her parents had passed away years ago, Richard remembered that some of Valerie's relatives might hold answers. He thought of Dolores, a cousin of Valerie who had been a constant presence in her life but always under the shadow of Valerie's strict parents. Dolores lived in an elegant house on the outskirts of the city. Reserved yet warm, Dolores had always been different from the rest of Valerie's family. Richard hoped that after all these years, she would be willing to speak honestly. When they arrived, the neighborhood was quiet, filled with children playing in the streets and the scent of home-cooked meals in the air. Richard parked the car in front of Dolores's home, a modest yet well-kept house with faded flowers in pots near the door. He knocked, but no one answered. Determined, he knocked again, louder this time. Finally, an older woman appeared at the window, squinting as if trying to recognize them. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously. "Lucia, it's me, Richard. I don't know if you remember, you were with Valerie for many years," Richard replied. The woman's eyes widened in surprise, her cautious expression softening into a mix of nostalgia and pain. Slowly, she opened the door, and upon seeing Sophie behind Richard, she froze as if she were looking at a ghost. "My God," murmured Lucia, clutching her chest. "It's her, isn't it? It's Sophie." Sophie stepped forward, confused. "You know who I am?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I could never forget your face, child. I saw you when you were just a baby. Valerie. Valerie asked me to care for you. It was the hardest decision of her life." Richard, overwhelmed by emotions, stepped forward. "Lucia, we need the truth. Valerie never told me we had a daughter. Why? What really happened?" Lucia sighed, inviting them into her modest living room. They sat around a small table, and with a trembling voice, Lucia began to speak. "Valerie was terrified, Richard. Her family forced her to hide her pregnancy. Your marriage was struggling at the time, and her parents were afraid the news would destroy everything. She begged me to take Sophie and raise her far from the chaos. But I couldn't keep her. My situation was complicated, so I found a family who promised to give her a loving home. It was the hardest decision I ever made." Sophie gripped her hands tightly in her lap, fighting back tears. "Why didn't anyone come looking for me? Why didn't anyone think about what it would mean for me to grow up not knowing the truth?" Lucia looked at her with sorrow. "Valerie wanted to find you, I know she did. But fear and guilt always held her back. She thought it was better for you to stay away from the pain we carried." Richard felt a mix of guilt and fury. If only he had known, if Valerie had trusted him, things might have been different. He reached out and held Sophie's trembling hand. "Sophie, this doesn't change what I want for us. I want us to build something together, to not let the past define what we can have now." Lucia watched them with silent tears streaming down her face. "I hope you both find the peace that Valerie never had." Although they had uncovered part of the truth, Lucia's words left Richard and Sophie with more questions than answers. What other secrets had Valerie kept hidden, and how would they face them together? Enrique leaned back in his chair, watching Richard and Sophie with a calculating expression, as if weighing how much truth to reveal. His silence filled the room with palpable tension until he finally let out a long sigh. "Fine, I'll start from the beginning," he said in a low voice. "But let me be clear, I was just following orders. Valerie's parents were relentless. They hired me to handle the adoption process and ensure everything was done discreetly." Richard clenched his fists, barely containing his anger. Discreet? That decision destroyed Valerie. How could you be a part of something like that? Enrique met his gaze with a solemn expression. "You don't understand, Richard. Valerie was desperate. Her parents pressured her with every kind of threat imaginable. I tried to convince them there was another way, but they wouldn't listen. All they cared about was preserving appearances and protecting the family's reputation." Sophie, who had been silent until then, finally spoke up. "And what happened after that? How was it decided which family would adopt me?" Enrique shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "There were many families interested, but in the end, Valerie's parents chose one that met their standards. They had resources, but more importantly, they had no ties to the society you lived in. They wanted Sophie far away, with no chance of anyone connecting the dots." Sophie gripped Valerie's letter tightly in her hands, a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside her. "Did you ever think about how much pain this caused my mother? Did you care about what I would feel, growing up far from her?" Enrique hesitated before shaking his head. "No. At the time, I was just doing my job. But as the years went by, I started to regret it. Valerie reached out to me years later. She wanted to find you, Sophie. But she never had the courage to take the next step. She always said it was too late, that maybe you were better off without her." Richard, unable to contain himself, slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing through the luxurious office. "That's unacceptable. You could have done something. Instead of protecting Valerie, you chose to obey that heartless family." Enrique regarded him with a tired expression. "It wasn't that simple, Richard. Valerie was living in a gilded cage, and I was under their shadow too. But I understand your anger. That's why I kept something, just in case Valerie or you ever needed proof." Richard and Sophie exchanged a glance. "Proof?" Sophie asked quickly. "What proof?" Enrique stood and opened a drawer in his desk, pulling out an aged folder, which he placed on the table. "This is everything: documents, letters from Valerie's parents, and the original adoption records. It confirms everything I've told you and might help you understand more." Sophie reached for the folder with trembling hands, but Richard gently stopped her before she could open it. "This doesn't change the past, Sophie, but it might help us find the peace we need." Sophie nodded, her eyes brimming with tears as she held the folder close to her chest. Enrique looked at them, his face tinged with what seemed like genuine remorse. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said at last. "Valerie was an extraordinary woman. If she had been braver, things might have turned out differently." Richard and Sophie left the office in silence, carrying the folder that promised to reveal the deepest truths of their shared story. As they walked through the bustling streets of downtown, Sophie finally spoke, her voice steady. "No matter what's in these documents, I know this: I want to keep learning about my mother, through her story, her diary, and what she left behind." Richard nodded, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "And I want to get to know you, Sophie. It's what Valerie would have wanted." They both knew the folder might bring answers but also new wounds. Still, they were determined to face it all, together. Back at the mansion, Richard and Sophie sat at the study table with Enrique's folder between them. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and a touch of unease. Sophie took a deep breath before opening it, her hands trembling slightly. Richard watched her closely, feeling both her nervousness and his own. Inside the folder were various documents, certificates, letters, and legal records that seemed to have been carefully preserved. On the first page, a letter bearing the letterhead of Valerie's parents caught their attention. Sophie began reading aloud. To whom it may concern. We hereby confirm that Sophie's adoption will be conducted under strict confidentiality. This agreement ensures that there will be no contact between the parties involved. We do this solely to guarantee the well-being of our daughter Valerie and the child in question. Sophie paused her reading, her voice breaking. She couldn't believe that her life had been treated as a mere transaction. Richard, his jaw tight, picked up the next document, an adoption contract. As he read through it, he noticed something unusual. Look at this, Sophie, he said, pointing to a paragraph at the bottom. This document doesn't just protect the adoptive parents, it also includes a clause requiring that the child be raised outside the country for at least 5 years. Sophie frowned. Outside the country? But I grew up here. I never left Mexico. My adoptive parents never mentioned moving. Richard nodded slowly. That means something changed. Maybe your adoptive parents didn't follow all the conditions. But there's more here, Sophie. Look at these letters. He picked up a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. As he unfolded the first one, they both recognized Valerie's handwriting. It was a letter addressed to Enrique. Enrique. I'm losing the battle against fear. Every day I think of Sophie, and every day I wonder if I made the right decision. I know it's possible she'll never forgive me, but if she ever decides to search for me, please make sure she knows I always loved her. Richard knows nothing, and I can't share this burden with him. I just want Sophie to be happy, even if it breaks my heart not to be by her side. Tears streamed down Sophie's cheeks as she held the letter close to her chest. Everything she had read in Valerie's journal and heard from Dolores and Lucia now carried even more weight. She never stopped thinking about me, Sophie murmured, her voice breaking. All this time, I thought I had been forgotten, but I was wrong. Richard placed a comforting hand over Sophie's. You're not alone, Sophie. And you never will be. Valerie made mistakes, but they were out of love. Now it's up to us to heal these wounds. Sophie nodded, her tears still falling but with a newfound determination lighting up her face. I want to know more, she said. I want to find everything she left behind. Richard pulled out the last document from the folder, a record of payments that initially seemed irrelevant. However, as they reviewed the details, they noticed the payments were made to an institution called Casa de Luz. Casa de Luz? Sophie asked. I've never heard of that place. Richard thought for a moment. It looks like an organization, maybe an orphanage or a care home. Valerie might have had some connection to it. They decided to investigate Casa de Luz further. Though they had no idea what they might uncover, they felt this path could lead them to a crucial part of the truth they had been searching for. The next day, Richard and Sophie began their investigation into Casa de Luz. After several phone calls and online searches, they finally found information about the institution. Casa de Luz was a foster home established more than 3 decades ago, dedicated to supporting young women in vulnerable situations. The name resonated in Sophie's heart as a potential key piece of her mother's story. Richard called the contact number listed on the website. A woman with a kind voice answered. Good afternoon, Casa de Luz. How can I help you? Hello, my name is Richard. I'm looking for information about possible records related to Valerie Gutierrez. I believe she was involved with your institution some years ago. There was a brief silence on the other end before the woman replied. Valerie Gutierrez, that name sounds familiar. Please give me a moment. Sophie, sitting next to Richard, nervously clasped her hands as they waited. After a few minutes, the woman returned to the line. Yes, we have records of Valerie. She was one of our volunteers for a time. But also, it seems she made regular donations to us. Sophie looked up at Richard, surprised. Volunteer, she murmured. She never mentioned that. Could we visit? Richard asked. It's important for us to understand more about her connection to you. Of course, the woman replied. We're open this afternoon. My name is Carmen, and I'll be here to meet you. A few hours later, Richard and Sophie arrived at Casa de Luz, a modest yet warm building with brightly painted walls and a small garden at the entrance. Carmen, a middle-aged woman with short hair and a kind smile, greeted them at the door. Thank you for coming, she said as she guided them to a small room. I've reviewed the files we have on Valerie. It seems she was here for several months many years ago, helping young women facing unplanned pregnancies or difficult situations. Sophie, sitting at the edge of her chair, quickly asked, why would she come here? She didn't seem like someone who would need that kind of help. Carmen nodded, understanding Sophie's confusion. Valerie didn't come here seeking help for herself, she explained. Rather, it seemed like she was searching for redemption. She helped many young women, offering emotional support and donations. But there was always something in her eyes, as if she was carrying her own sadness. Richard frowned, trying to connect the dots. Did she ever mention her daughter, Sophie? He asked. Carmen paused for a moment, reflecting. Not directly, she finally replied. But I remember she often spoke about how difficult decisions can leave lasting marks. She once mentioned that there was something in her past she wished she could change, something she had done to protect someone she loved. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. Her mother had been trying to atone for her decisions for years, helping other women who were likely facing situations similar to her own. Yet, she had done so in silence, carrying the weight of her pain alone. Can we see anything she left here? Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Are there any records or anything else we can take with us? Carmen nodded and returned minutes later with a small box. Inside were letters and photographs of Valerie with some of the women she had helped. In every photo, Valerie wore a warm smile, though her eyes revealed a melancholy that Sophie immediately recognized. One letter, in particular, caught Sophie's attention. It was addressed to Casa de Luz but seemed more like a confession than a formal note. Carmen. Every time I come here, I feel like I'm one step closer to finding peace. Helping these women reminds me that, although I made decisions that broke my heart, I can do something to prevent others from suffering the same. I hope that, one day, Sophie will understand that everything I did was out of love. Sophie couldn't hold back her tears. Her mother had taken her pain to a place where she could transform it into something positive for others. Richard placed a firm hand on her shoulder, sharing her emotion. Valerie was stronger than we ever imagined, he said softly. Sophie, she didn't just think of you, she lived for you, even in her absence. As they left Casa de Luz, Sophie carried the box with the letters and photographs, determined to continue learning about her mother through these small glimpses of her past. For the first time, she felt that the distance between them, though insurmountable physically, was beginning to close in spirit. That night, back at the mansion, Sophie couldn't take her eyes off the box she had brought from Casa de Luz. The letters, photographs, and her mother's words seemed to call out to her, as if they were trying to complete a story that had been unfinished her entire life. Sitting on the floor of the main hall, with Gabriel asleep nearby, she opened the box once again. Richard sat across from her, ready to accompany her every step of the way. As Sophie sifted through the letters, she found one in particular dated just a few months before Valerie's death. The handwriting was more hurried than the others, as though written under strong emotion. Sophie began to read aloud. Dear Casa de Luz. Today, I feel that my time is running out, even though no one has told me anything is wrong. It's an intuition, as if my heart knows it will soon have to say goodbye. I've realized that even though Sophie never returned to my life, she has always been in my heart. I've lived with the hope that one day she might forgive me, that she might understand I did the best I could with what I knew at the time. Richard lowered his head, his eyes glistening with emotion. Valerie knew her time was near, he murmured. But even then, Sophie was all she thought about. Sophie pressed the letter to her chest, feeling a blend of pain and love that was almost indescribable. My mother never stopped looking for me in her own way, she said, her voice breaking. Even if she didn't do it physically, she was always with me, even when I didn't know it. Determined to support Sophie on this emotional journey, Richard pulled out a photo album he had kept for years. It was an album Valerie had created, filled with special moments from their life together. He placed it in front of Sophie and began flipping through the pages. Here's our wedding, Richard said, pointing to a black and white photograph of a young Valerie in a lace dress. And this was when we bought our first house. Sophie studied each image closely, searching for pieces of the woman she now felt so connected to yet still so far from. Near the back of the album, she found a photograph that left her breathless. It was an image of Valerie holding a baby. Sophie didn't remember the moment, but she immediately knew it was her. Is this me? Sophie asked, touching the photograph delicately. Richard nodded, his voice trembling slightly. It was the only time she got to hold you before her parents forced her to give you up. Valerie insisted on taking this photo, as if she knew it would be all she'd have left of you. Sophie couldn't hold back her tears. It was the first time she saw tangible proof that her mother had fought for her, even though circumstances had torn them apart. Now, more than ever, she felt the need to honor Valerie's memory, not only by understanding her past but by ensuring her legacy of love and strength was never forgotten. Breaking the silence, Richard spoke with a newfound determination. Sophie, we've come a long way to get here. But I believe there's still more to uncover. If Valerie left these letters and this photograph, there might be something else we haven't found yet. Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with tears but also with resolve. You're right. We can't stop now. I want to know everything about my mother, every detail she left for us. Both of them knew their journey was far from over. But in that moment, holding the letters, the photographs, and the album, they felt closer than ever to Valerie and to the love that had always guided her decisions, even the most difficult ones. The next morning, Sophie woke up with a newfound energy. After the revelations of the previous night, one thing was clear in her heart: her mother had lived trapped between love and fear, but she had never stopped fighting for her, even indirectly. As they sat for breakfast in the mansion's expansive dining room, Sophie and Richard began planning their next steps. I've been thinking, Richard said as he poured coffee. Valerie was meticulous. She always kept important things in special places. If there's anything else she left behind, it might still be here in the mansion. Sophie frowned, intrigued. Where could she have hidden something so important? Richard set down his cup and stood, gesturing for her to follow. There's a room in the attic I hardly ever go into. It was Valerie's personal space, her little sanctuary. After she passed, I didn't have the courage to go in there, but I think now is the time. They climbed up to the attic, a space seemingly frozen in time. The room was filled with trunks, wooden shelves lined with dusty books, and small ornate boxes. Sunlight filtered through a round window, bathing the space in a warm glow. Sophie felt a reverence as she stepped inside, as though entering her mother's private sanctuary. They carefully began to sift through the belongings, opening boxes and flipping through notebooks. Sophie found old dresses, letters from Valerie's childhood friends, and family photographs she had never seen before. But it wasn't until Richard moved a heavy trunk that they uncovered something unexpected: a small safe embedded in the wall. This is where Valerie kept her most valuable things, Richard said, crouching to inspect it. But I don't remember the combination. Sophie knelt beside him, studying the safe with curiosity. Are there any clues? Maybe she used something meaningful, like a date. Richard thought for a moment and then entered their wedding date on the keypad. The safe didn't open. He tried Valerie's birth date, but it still didn't work. Sophie thought aloud. What about my birthday? If she thought about me as much as it seems, maybe that's it. Richard entered Sophie's birth date, and a soft click confirmed the combination was correct. They looked at each other, both surprised and excited, before carefully opening the safe door. Inside was a thick folder, an additional journal, and a small wooden box. Sophie picked up the folder first, her hands trembling slightly. When she opened it, she found legal documents and a letter addressed to her. Dear Sophie. If you're reading this, it means you found your way back to me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to say this to you in person, but you have always been the light of my life, even from a distance. Everything I did was out of love, though I know it may not seem that way. Inside this folder are documents explaining the truth about your adoption and the reasons behind my decisions. I hope you can forgive me someday. I love you with all my heart. Your mother, Valerie. Sophie let out a choked sob as she held the letter close to her chest. It felt as though Valerie were speaking to her from the past, trying to comfort her and provide the answers she had longed for. Richard, moved, placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. She knew you'd reach this moment, he said softly. She always believed you'd find your way. Sophie picked up the journal from the safe and opened it to a random page. What she found left her breathless. Enrique's name, along with details of meetings Valerie had had with him in the months leading up to her death. There was also a mention of something called the legacy, though it lacked further explanation. What's the legacy? Sophie asked, showing the page to Richard. I don't know, Richard admitted. But it sounds important. Maybe it's something she left for you. Lastly, they opened the small wooden box. Inside was a gold necklace with a heart-shaped locket. Sophie carefully took it out, feeling it was a tangible connection to her mother. When she opened the locket, she saw a tiny photograph of Valerie holding a baby, her. As they embraced silently in the attic, they realized this discovery was only the beginning of something much bigger. Valerie hadn't just left behind memories, she had left clues, threads of a story that could change everything they thought they knew. The discovery of the diary and documents in the safe filled Sophie and Richard with new questions. Sitting in the attic, they began carefully reading through the diary's pages, searching for any mention of the legacy and trying to piece together the intricate puzzle Valerie had left behind. As Sophie flipped through the diary, she found an entry that seemed pivotal. Valerie's handwriting was tighter, as if written in urgency or anxiety. I've decided to create something for Sophie, something to remind her that she was always loved. I'll call it the legacy. It's my way of ensuring that, even if we never meet again, she'll always have a part of me with her. Enrique helped me organize it, but I'm scared it won't be enough. Sophie looked up at Richard, her heart pounding. This is important, she said, pointing to the page. My mother created something for me, but she doesn't explain exactly what it is. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Enrique might know more. If he was involved in this, he could have the answers we need. Sophie clutched the diary to her chest, a mix of excitement and anxiety swirling within her. What if he doesn't want to talk, she asked, remembering how difficult it had been to get information from Enrique the first time. Richard stood up, his resolve clear. We don't have a choice. He was part of this, and if Valerie trusted him, then we can too. We can't leave this unresolved. That same day, Sophie and Richard returned to Enrique's office. This time, the lawyer's expression was different when he saw them enter. There was a mix of curiosity and resignation in his eyes, as if he knew the conversation they were about to have was inevitable. What do you need now? Enrique asked, closing a file on his desk. Sophie pulled the diary from her bag and placed it in front of him. My mother mentioned something called the legacy, she said directly. We know you helped her create it. We need to know what it means and where it is. Enrique looked at the diary for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the wooden desk. Finally, he let out a sigh. Valerie was a remarkable woman, he began, his tone softer than they'd heard before. When she talked to me about the legacy, She described it as something she wanted to leave behind for you, Sophie. But it wasn't entirely material. Sophie frowned in confusion. What do you mean? Enrique leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. The legacy was a trust fund Valerie set up to ensure that, if you ever found her, you would have the financial security she couldn't provide when you were a child. But it was more than just money. She left letters, videos, and personal items she collected over the years. All of it is stored in a safe place, waiting for you. Sophie felt her breath catch. Where is it? She asked urgently. Enrique pulled an envelope from a drawer and handed it to her. Here's the address. It's a bank with a safety deposit box registered under Valerie's name. You'll need this key to open it. He placed a small silver key on the desk. Sophie picked it up carefully, holding it as though it were the most precious object in the world. Why didn't you tell us this before? Richard asked, his tone still tinged with distrust. Because I wasn't sure you were ready for what you'd find, Enrique replied. Valerie asked me to wait until Sophie showed she truly wanted to know her story. Now, I see that moment has come. Sophie and Richard left Enrique's office with the envelope and key in hand, their hearts brimming with anticipation. The next day, they would visit the bank to uncover what Valerie had left in that mysterious box. As they walked through streets bathed in the light of the setting sun, Sophie clutched the key tightly, feeling that each step brought her closer to her mother and the love Valerie had always held for her. The next day, Sophie and Richard arrived early at the bank listed in the envelope. The building was an imposing structure, its marble columns and ornate facade exuding a sense of solemnity. Sophie held the key tightly in one hand while the other rested nervously on Gabriel's stroller. Richard walked beside her, offering silent but steadfast support. Inside, a manager escorted them to a private room. There, a heavy metal safety deposit box awaited. Sophie looked at the key, her heart pounding in her chest. With a steady hand, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it until she heard the soft click that released the door. Inside the box was a thick folder, several sealed envelopes, and a small velvet case. Sophie carefully lifted the items and placed them on the table. As she opened the folder, Richard leaned forward, equally eager to uncover its contents. The folder contained legal documents confirming the existence of a substantial trust fund established in Sophie's name years ago by Valerie. But what caught Sophie's attention most were the letters. There was one for each birthday Valerie had never been able to celebrate with her. Sophie picked up the first letter, marked with the number 1, and opened it. Her mother's familiar handwriting filled the page. My dear Sophie. Today is your first birthday, and though I'm not with you to celebrate, I want you to know how much I love you. Every day, I think of you, who you will become, the dreams you will have. I hope that one day you'll read this and feel my love, even from afar. Tears began to stream down Sophie's face as she read. Richard, sitting beside her, gently took her hand. She left you everything she could, he said softly. This is her way of being with you, even now. Sophie opened more letters, each recounting significant moments in Valerie's life and the hopes she had for her daughter. One letter, unmarked, seemed to have been written shortly before Valerie's death. My dear Sophie. I don't know if you will ever read this, but I want you to know that my greatest dream was always to see you again. I loved you from the very first moment and never stopped. If you've made it this far, it means you found the legacy. It's not just a trust or letters, it's proof that you were always my light in the darkness. Please, live your life fully and know that I will always be with you. With all my love. Mom. Sophie placed the letter on the table and buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions. Richard moved closer and wrapped his arms around her, allowing her to release the weight she had carried for so long. Inside the velvet case, they found a wristwatch with an inscription on the back that read, For Sophie, time will never separate our love. Sophie held it tightly, feeling an even deeper connection to her mother through the simple yet profound gift. As they carefully packed the documents and letters, Sophie spoke, her voice still trembling but filled with newfound determination. All of this, it's not just proof of my mother's love. It's an opportunity to move forward, to honor her by living fully. Richard nodded, proud of the strength he saw in Sophie. And I'll be with you every step of the way, Sophie. Valerie would be so proud of you. As they stepped out of the bank, Sophie looked up at the sky and felt, for the first time, that the emptiness she had carried for so many years was beginning to be filled with the love Valerie had poured into every detail of the legacy. Back at the mansion, Sophie couldn't take her eyes off the letters and a watch she had found in the safety deposit box. Sitting in the study, with Gabriel sleeping peacefully in a nearby crib, she opened Valerie's final letter once again. Each word seemed to resonate more deeply now that she understood the full context. It was as if her mother was speaking directly to her, guiding her from the past. Richard entered the study with 2 cups of tea and sat across from Sophie. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a mix of pride and nostalgia. "You've come a long way, Sophie," he said, offering her a cup. "Valerie would have been so happy to see you here, piecing together everything she dreamed of." Sophie gave a faint smile, staring at the tea without really noticing it. "I think I'm finally starting to understand her, Dad," she said, using that word for the first time without hesitation. "I always thought she abandoned me, but now I see she protected me in the only way she knew how." Richard looked up, surprised but deeply moved by her choice of words. He gently squeezed her hand, letting the moment speak for itself. As they shared that quiet connection, Sophie remembered something else she had found in the box, a small unopened envelope addressed to Casa de Luz. She pulled it out from among the papers and showed it to Richard. "This was in my mother's box," she said. "It's addressed to Casa de Luz, but I don't understand why she kept it in such an important place." Richard took the envelope, examining it closely. "Maybe Valerie left something there, something she couldn't take with her." Sophie nodded, sensing that there was more to uncover. They decided to return to Casa de Luz the following day to deliver the envelope and see if it revealed anything further. The next day at Casa de Luz. The next morning, Sophie and Richard arrived at Casa de Luz. Carmen greeted them warmly, though her expression reflected curiosity when Sophie handed her the envelope. "This was in my mother's safety deposit box," Sophie explained. "We're not sure what it means, but it seems important." Carmen carefully opened the envelope. Inside, there was a small key accompanied by a note. "Carmen. If Sophie ever comes looking for answers, give her this. It contains something very special that I wanted her to have. Thank you for being part of my life and for helping me find purpose in the midst of my pain. With love. Valerie." Carmen looked at Sophie, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Valerie truly thought of everything," she said softly. "This must be for the box we've kept in our archive. Follow me." She led them to a small room at the back of the building, where a shelf filled with labeled boxes lined the walls. Carmen searched until she found one marked with Valerie's name. She used the key to open it and placed the box on the table in front of Sophie. When Sophie opened it, she found a handmade scrapbook. Every page was filled with photographs, notes, and drawings. It was a visual diary of Valerie's life, but what stood out most to Sophie were the images of her mother helping other women at Casa de Luz, smiling as she held babies or embracing young mothers. On one of the last pages was a handwritten note. "My dearest Sophie. I want you to see this and understand that, although I made mistakes, I also found ways to heal. Helping these women gave me purpose. I hope that, by looking through this, you can see that I always carried your love with me and tried to do something good with the time I had. With all my love. Mom." Sophie closed the scrapbook, her eyes filled with tears but also with gratitude. "My mother turned her pain into love for others," she said quietly. "And now I know that I want to do the same." Richard looked at her with pride. "Sophie, your mother would be as proud of you as I am right now. You found her legacy, and you're making it your own." As they left Casa de Luz with the scrapbook in hand, Sophie felt that the circle was finally beginning to close. She had uncovered the depth of her mother's love and now understood that her mission was to carry that legacy forward, ensuring that Valerie's sacrifices would never be in vain. That night, back at the mansion, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about everything she had discovered at Casa de Luz. Sitting in the main living room with the scrapbook open in front of her, she gently ran her fingers over the photographs and handwritten notes from Valerie. Each page seemed to tell not only her mother's story but also that of the women she had helped, reflecting the strength Valerie had found amid her own pain. Richard entered with a glass of wine in hand, watching Sophie with a mix of pride and tenderness. He walked over to the sofa and sat next to her, leaning in to look at the scrapbook. "It's incredible how she turned so much suffering into something so beautiful," Richard said softly. "Valerie never stopped being brave, even when she was carrying more than anyone should." Sophie nodded, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "Now I understand why she always sought to help others. I think she was trying to make up for what she felt she couldn't give me." She turned to a specific page in the scrapbook, where a photograph showed Valerie with a group of smiling women and children. Beneath the image, Valerie had written, "The family we create is just as important as the one we lose." Sophie looked up at Richard. "I want to continue this, Dad. I want to do something in her honor. Not just to remember her, but to carry on what she started." Richard looked at her, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to transform Casa de Luz," Sophie replied, a newfound light in her eyes. "I want to expand it, give it more resources, reach more women like the ones my mother helped. She left me this legacy, and I feel it's my responsibility to keep it alive." Richard smiled, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Valerie would be so proud of you, Sophie. This is exactly what she would have wanted. And you have my full support." Hearing her father's words brought Sophie a wave of relief and motivation. For the first time in a long while, she felt not only connected to her past but also that she was building a future full of purpose. The transformation begins. In the weeks that followed, Sophie and Richard began working on their plan to revitalize Casa de Luz. They used the trust fund Valerie had created as the foundation to finance the project. Sophie met with Carmen and the rest of the Casa de Luz team, sharing her vision of expanding their reach and improving the facilities. Each passing day brought Sophie closer to her mother in spirit. Working at the place that had meant so much to Valerie gave Sophie a sense of peace and closeness she had never experienced before. One afternoon, while reviewing blueprints for the building's renovation, Sophie found one last letter from Valerie tucked between the pages of the scrapbook. She opened it carefully, immediately recognizing her mother's handwriting. "Dear Sophie. If you're reading this, it means you found your way to Casa de Luz. I want you to know that this place was my salvation in so many ways. Here, I found hope, purpose, and a way to honor you, even from afar. I hope this place becomes meaningful to you too, that you find in it the strength to create something beautiful. I always believed in you, Sophie. I always will. With all my love. Mom." Sophie pressed the letter to her chest, feeling a warmth envelop her like a gentle hug. She looked up at Richard, who was standing in the doorway, watching her with a calm smile. "We'll do it, Mom," Sophie whispered to herself. "I promise your legacy will live on forever." As the sun set outside the mansion, Sophie and Richard continued working, united by a purpose greater than themselves. They had transformed Valerie's love and sacrifice into a mission that promised to change lives, ensuring that even though she was no longer physically with them, her spirit would continue to light the way for those who needed it most. Months later, Sophie's dream began to take shape. Casa de Luz had been transformed thanks to the combined efforts of Sophie, Richard, and the institution's team. The old facilities had been renovated, and new spaces were built, a therapy room, a workshop area for skill training, and a small medical center. In the garden, a commemorative plaque was placed in Valerie's honor, engraved with a phrase from one of her letters, "Love can heal even the deepest wounds." Sophie walked through the hallways of the newly renovated center, watching the women and children who now filled the space. Every smile, every conversation reminded her of her mother. Carmen, who had remained at the helm of the team, approached Sophie with an expression of pride. "This is extraordinary, Sophie," Carmen said with emotion in her voice. "Your mother would be so happy to see what you've accomplished here." Sophie smiled, looking toward the garden where several children were playing. "I didn't do it alone, Carmen. This place is a part of my mother, but it's also a part of everyone who believed in her and her vision." As they spoke, Richard arrived, accompanied by Gabriel, who was now toddling clumsily as he explored the space. Richard carried a small box in his hands, and as he approached, he handed it to Sophie. "This is something I wanted to give you," Richard said, his voice laden with emotion. "I found it a few days ago among the things Valerie had kept at the mansion." Sophie opened the box carefully and found a gold star-shaped pendant inside. On the back was an inscription that read, "Keep shining, Sophie. Love, Mom." Her eyes filled with tears as she held the pendant. It was as though Valerie had always known Sophie would find a way to carry her light forward. "Thank you, Dad," Sophie said, her voice breaking as she hugged Richard. "This means more than I can put into words." Richard held her tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Sophie. You've turned pain into something beautiful, something that changes lives. And I know Valerie would be proud too." The grand opening of Casa de Luz. On the day of the official reopening of Casa de Luz, Sophie gave an emotional speech in front of the new residents, the staff, and the donors who had supported the project. Wearing her mother's pendant around her neck, she spoke from her heart. "My mother, Valerie, always believed in the power of love and hope," she said, her voice resonating with strength and clarity. "Today, we are here not just to honor her memory but to continue her legacy. Casa de Luz is not just a refuge, it is a place where people can find strength, support, and a new chance to start over." The audience erupted in applause, and Sophie felt a warmth fill her chest. Gabriel, who was sitting on Richard's lap, raised his hands toward his mother, babbling with a wide smile. After the ceremony, Sophie spent a quiet moment alone in front of Valerie's commemorative plaque. With the pendant between her fingers, she closed her eyes and whispered, "We did it, Mom. Your love lives on in this place and in me. You'll always be my guide." The wind blew gently, as if Valerie was answering her from somewhere, and Sophie smiled. She had found her purpose, and with it, a way to keep her mother alive in every act of love and kindness. A year after the grand reopening of Casa de Luz, Sophie and Richard celebrated the continued success of the project. The center had grown beyond their wildest dreams, helping hundreds of women and children find refuge, support, and a new beginning. Sophie, now more confident and fulfilled, had fully embraced her role as the leader of the center, while Richard remained by her side as a mentor and guide. One afternoon, as Sophie reviewed reports in her office at Casa de Luz, Carmen entered with an excited expression. "Sophie, someone's here to see you," she said with a mysterious smile. Intrigued, Sophie stood and walked to the lobby. There, she saw an older woman with a face that seemed vaguely familiar. Beside her was a young mother holding a baby, clearly nervous but determined. Sophie approached them, smiling warmly. "Hello," Sophie said, extending her hand. "I'm Sophie. How can I help you?" The older woman took Sophie's hand and looked at her with tears in her eyes. "My name is Lucia," she said softly. "I was your mother's housekeeper. I was with Valerie during some of the most difficult times in her life. I heard about what you've done here, and I couldn't stay away." Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. She had heard about Lucia from Dolores and Enrique, but she had never imagined she would meet her. She extended a trembling hand toward her. "It's an honor to meet you," Sophie said sincerely. "Thank you for being there for my mother when she needed it most." Lucia nodded, her eyes filled with emotion. Valerie always spoke of you. Even from afar, she never stopped loving you. I know she would be so proud of the woman you've become. The young mother beside Lucia stepped forward. My name is Anna, she said shyly. I'm here because Casa de Luz gave me a chance. Sophie, this place gave me hope, and I wanted to thank you personally. Sophie was deeply moved. She embraced Anna warmly, gently patting her back as the baby in the young woman's arms began to giggle. This, Sophie realized, was the true meaning of Valerie's dream, a place where love and support could transform lives. That evening at the mansion. Later that evening, Sophie sat in the garden under the stars, holding Valerie's scrapbook in her lap. Richard joined her with a glass of wine, smiling as he watched Gabriel play with a small toy airplane nearby. You know something? Richard said after a moment of silence. I think Valerie always knew you had this strength within you. She saw something in you that maybe you didn't even realize was there. Sophie smiled, gazing at the stars. She gave me everything I am, even when she wasn't with me. And now, I want to make sure her love continues to touch lives, generation after generation. Richard looked at her with pride. You're already doing that, Sophie. And I'm certain she knows it. As Sophie watched Gabriel laugh under the moonlight, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had found not only her mother in the memories and love Valerie had left behind, but also herself. Casa de Luz was more than a project, it was a testament to everything Valerie had stood for. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment and whispered into the wind. Thank you, Mom. For everything. You'll always be my guide. The night air seemed to respond with a gentle whisper, as though Valerie was there, smiling from somewhere among the stars, proud of the family she had left behind and the legacy that now thrived through Sophie.